Welcome to the Surviving BPD Relationship Breakup Podcast. If someone in your life has BPD, you know how difficult it can be, and you need to learn how to heal from those toxic relationships. And that's where this show comes in. Expert education, expert knowledge, expert insight, and delivered with compassion and empathy. With your host, counselor and trauma recovery coach, AJ Mahari. To purchase and book sessions with AJ, go to ajmahari.ca. Now your host, AJ Mahari.
A couple things before we start this episode. I have a website for this podcast, and it's at survivingbpdrelationshipbreakup.com. Interactive website. It's a website is its own feed for the podcast and also for my YouTube channel. So if you'd like to get a lot of the videos that aren't in this podcast, you'd like to check those out, you can do that at survivingbpdrelationshipbreakup.com. I would just like to encourage you to please leave a 5-star rating for this podcast if you find it helpful, to help this podcast keep growing and keep reaching more and more people who could benefit from this content. I get a lot of people with BPD rating it at 1 star because, they have all these problems with what I'm saying, and they think it's horrible and disgusting and all that kind of BPD kind of stuff. This podcast website is survivingbpdrelationshipbreakup.com. And now, let's dive into today's episode. What is reactive abuse, and why do codependents often reactively abuse people with borderline personality disorder? In this episode of this podcast, I'm going to give you a detailed explanation of what reactive abuse is and 7 in-depth reasons or explanations for this dynamic in relationships with borderlines by people with codependency. So let me just first say, if you have been reactionary in abuse with a person with BPD in your life, in any relationship type, I've been working with clients for 35 years and can help you with any reactive abuse. Can help you to figure out what you really need, what you really want, they might not match, and what can you do about your reactive abuse. There are some clients I have worked with over the years that have had even bigger abusive reactions to a borderline partner or family member or sibling or parent. Not all codependent reactive abuse is reactive. Most of it is. But there are some people out there with codependency. Some people need to learn their own anger management and how anger bleeds into people's emotions, even in codependency at times. What reactive abuse actually is? Reactive abuse is a survival-driven, trauma-activated reaction that happens when someone who is typically passive, people-pleasing, or conflict avoidant, maybe has fear of abandonment, becomes pushed past their tolerance threshold by chronic emotional dysregulation, chaos, provocation, yelling or screaming or raging or silent treatment, or boundary violations from a partner with untreated borderline personality disorder. Maybe they've had some treatment, but reactive abuse is not actual abuse in the intentional power-seeking sense, but it is still something that you need to take seriously if you have been reactively abusive. It is a trauma-activated counter-reaction of a person who has been chronically invalidated, blamed for things they didn't do, shouted at or accused repeatedly, pulled into circular arguments they cannot escape, also hit with often borderline-induced conversations, which is a little bit different than the circular jade, justify, argue, defend, and explain to the borderline, and that circle conversation. Exhausted by emotional whiplash, subjected to hot-cold patterns, mean-sweet cycles, discarded, ghosted, and sometimes then pulled back in. Codependence, because of your background of trauma, fawning, and emotional over-adaptation, you are especially vulnerable to reactive abuse. You try to stay calm, logical, and loving, but eventually snap, often in ways that feel completely out of character. Reactive abuse is the moment the codependent, after trying desperately to keep the peace, maybe trying to get out of a room, that you're blocked in, things like that, finally erupts. Not because you are abusive, but because the pattern became unbearable for your nervous system. Nervous system overwhelm, not malice, drives reactive abuse. Why codependents often reactively abuse borderlines. Like I said before, I'm going to explain 7 reasons stated with nuance and rooted in trauma theory, object relations dynamics, and your established framework for BPD codependent relational patterns. Number 1, the nervous system cannot sustain chronic dysregulation exposure. Codependents are wired to, quote, keep the peace, unquote. Most are, maybe not all. But your nervous system is often shaped by childhood environment where you had to endure a lot of unpredictability. A partner with BPD triggers these old pathways: rapid mood swings, rage episodes, accusations, emotional abandonment, forced connection, sudden withdrawal. The codependent's body keeps attempting regulation, but chronic exposure to a partner who is dysregulated, accusing, or emotionally volatile eventually overwhelms the autonomic nervous system. When the body hits its limit, it can explode, yelling, slamming a door, screaming, or saying something really sharp or beyond. This is reactive abuse as a nervous system collapse, not an intent to abuse. Number 2, trauma bonding plus the push-pull cycle creates emotional exhaustion. Codependents in BPD relationships often endure idealization, rapid devaluation, silent treatment, raging, ghosting, discarding, hoovering, and all kinds of other things. These cycles destabilize even emotionally healthy people. For a codependent who already fears abandonment and over-identifies with being the fixer or the rescuer or a people pleaser, among other things, the cycle creates frantic attachment and emotional depletion. When emotional depletion becomes severe, the codependent may react in ways that shock even themselves. The reactive abuse is the outburst produced by emotional starvation, not domination. 3, codependents are pulled into projective identification, that of the borderline. Untreated BPD dynamics often involve unconscious projection or projective identification. The borderline feels unbearable, inner shame, or fear, and unconsciously pushes the codependent into the role of the bad object. So often bad object other representation of wounding parent. They accuse, blame, and provoke until the codependent defends, over-explains, tries to soothe, tries to fix, tries to prove loyalty. Eventually, the codependent snaps, and the BPD partner then says, quote, "See, you are the abusive one," unquote. This is the exact fulfillment of the projective identification cycle. The codependent is reactively behaving in alignment with the role of the borderline the role that the borderline consciously cast them in. 4, the codependent has never had healthy boundaries before, or usually not very healthy boundaries, in close relationships or in family of origin. Codependents often learned in childhood that conflict is dangerous, anger is unsafe, needs must be suppressed, Emotional expression leads to punishment. So they over-accommodate in adulthood. But chronic boundary violations from a borderline partner eventually ignite stored, unprocessed anger. When anger finally erupts after months or years of suppression, it often comes out reactively, intense, explosive, and unregulated. This is not characterological abuse. It is boundary injury, emotional backlog, trauma-based expression. It looks like abuse because it comes out all at once, but it's actually deprivation anger, not cruelty. 5. Reported false accusations are a psychological stressor, not to mention a financial one often too. Borderline partners often accuse codependents of cheating, lying, abandoning, disrespecting, plotting against them, not loving them enough, or things that you didn't do, like maybe they'll say that they'll hit themselves and get bruises, and they'll say that you beat them up. And then the cops come, and if you're the man, you're gone. And you're going to have to fight your way out of that more often than not. So repeated false accusations, like a lot of men get, maybe some women get from borderline men, I don't know. But the way that men get them is not only cheating, lying, abandoning, disrespecting, plotting against them, not loving them, quote, enough, unquote. It's trying to get them arrested. It's lying and confabulating and just telling police anything they can possibly tell them, hitting themselves first, etc., just to set you up. The codependent tries to calmly explain and reassure, but false accusations, especially when repeated during dysregulated episodes, become psychologically disabling. Over time, even the calmest person may yell, "Stop! That's not true!" You might have yelled that a lot in your life, or you might have said that a lot in the relationship that you might have been in or may still be in. This is the codependent defending reality under emotional duress, not abusing. It is reactive because it comes after long-term psychological pressure. 6. Fawn mode eventually flips into flight mode. Codependents stay in fawn for a long time, appeasing, softening their voice, over-explaining, placating, absorbing the anger, self-abandoning, trying to please the borderline, trying to do whatever they can for the person with BPD. But fawn is a survival mode, not a personality. Every survival mode has a collapse point. Once the codependent is emotionally cornered, their system may flip from fawn to fight. Not because they want to fight, but because they are out of options and psychologically overwhelmed. This, quote, fight, unquote, is the reactive abuse moment, often the first time the codependent uses assertive or raised voice after months or longer of passivity. 7. Circular arguments create entrapment, plus emotional panic. Borderline partners often use interrogations, rapid-fire questions, emotional cornering, hour-long, sometimes 13-hour-long, like hours-long arguments the codependent cannot exit. Demands for immediate answers, refusal to pause or de-escalate. Codependents feel trapped, suffocated, and psychologically cornered. At some point, codependent may yell, swear, scream, cry, push away, say something sharp. This reactive outburst is the codependent's attempt to escape the argument, not to harm the partner. Reactive abuse here is born from panic, not power. And final summary. Reactive abuse is best understood not as an abuse, but as a nervous system-driven response from a chronically overwhelmed, emotionally starved, and psychologically cornered partner, especially a codependent conditioned to absorb pain without boundaries. Codependents reactively abuse when they are pushed past their threshold. Their trauma is reactivated. Their nervous system collapses. They are being projectively identified into the, quote, bad object by the borderline. They cannot escape emotional entrapment. Their boundaries have been chronically violated, and their attachment trauma is triggered. So it's important to know that in this summary here, understanding doesn't equal excusing. If you have been reactionary in abusing your person with BPD, I've been working with clients, like I said before, for 35 years and can help you with any reactive abuse. There are some clients I have worked with over the years have had bigger abusive reactions to a person with BPD, partner, sibling, parent, etc. Not all codependent reactive abuse is reactive. Some people need to learn their own anger management and how anger bleeds into some people's emotions, even in codependency. Having said that, though, it's not been a high number of people I've worked with over the years, but every once in a while somebody comes along that, along with their codependency, they just have a lot of anger and they don't have maybe as much passive, patient, repetitive ability to keep trying to please that person with BPD. And things can go awry maybe more quickly and maybe just a little bit more extremely. But if that happens to you, or if that's happened to you, or if it's been reactive abuse and what that really means, that's still important. But I'm out here to work with you if I do resonate with you. It's essential to understand something very clearly. Even though reactive abuse comes from trauma activation, nervous system overwhelm, and survival responses, none of this excuses the behavior. It only explains it. Understanding the roots of reactive abuse helps people make sense of why they snapped, why they said things they regret, or why they engaged in a moment of self-betrayal. But explanation can never become justified. Reactive abuse still harms the relationship. It still wounds the other person. It still destabilizes the emotional environment. And it still pulls the codependent into a version of themselves they never wanted to be. The moment someone crosses into yelling, name-calling, threatening, retaliating, or acting out of character, it becomes a signal that their own boundaries have collapsed and their inner child is in distress, not a sign that hurting the other person is acceptable. Understanding why it happened brings clarity, interrupts shame spirals, identifies the trauma dynamics at play, and helps both partners see the pattern rather than demonizing the individuals. Well, some people that you're with BPD will never be able to see the patterns because they don't see their own and they won't see yours. But it's really important that you reach out and get help if you are going through any reactive abuse or any kind of abuse, to this person with BPD, because you really need to be able to take care of yourself and get into a healthier situation. Reactive abuse can never be used to minimize the impact. Both partners' behavior matters, regardless of who started the pattern or who was more dysregulated. Healing begins when the codependent can say, I understand why I reacted that way, but I'm still responsible for what I did. And the deeper step is recognizing I need to change this dynamic, not just justify it. Understanding gives insight, responsibility gives growth, and boundaries give safety. Reactive abuse is a sign that no one's needs are being met, and the relationship dynamic has reached a point where people require support, regulation, and intervention, not further blame. And having said that, I would also say that in many of these relationships, it's going to be up to the person with codependency to really end the relationship. Sometimes people with BPD, especially untreated, they'll ghost, they'll discard, but sometimes they come back. And it's going to be up to you to make the decision about why you know, or if you know, this is not good for you anymore. And when you get to reactive abuse, is there a chance that that can be worked through? Well, not really that often with people with BPD, especially untreated, because they're just going to, mock you and say you're the one that's so abusive, and they don't see their own thing, and they don't know who they are, and they don't understand how they're impacting you so negatively. But then they'll just want to be saying all the time that, well, but you did this, but you did that, but you said this, but you said that. And it's really like only going to be more of what maybe you already couldn't withstand anymore. And that gave way to reactive abuse. Just trying to keep yourself safe, just trying to get out of the situation, just trying to do something about all the conflict and the borderline emotional dysregulation. The really important to know that when these types of things start happening in relationships between codependents and borderlines often, if they're untreated or not well enough treated at all, they are going to spin this circle around you. And they're going to expect you to meet their every need because they're really experiencing you as the object of the representation of mommy or daddy, bad parent, in devaluation. And so you're going to be pressured and pressured and pressured and pushed, and you're going to go through the mean sweet cycle and the push-pull and the approach avoidance. And really, when that's going on and a person isn't even in therapy, and often I've talked to so many clients who have a partner in therapy or an ex or on and off partner, they're in therapy, but they're not in the right therapy. They're not doing the right thing. They're just probably going to the therapist to say that you are a horrible person and blah, 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 blah. And therapists sometimes just believe that. So the point is, you really have to think about getting your own help. And this is often a place in a relationship where everything collapses and falls apart. Because when a codependent can no longer stay calm, when your nervous system is shot, when you've had enough, but maybe you don't want to give up, it's really time to get into help and to really seriously consider that relationship would be best for you if it ended. Even when you might be having limerence and all kinds of rumination, and you might still just feel addicted to that person with BPD, but you're not. Because there's things that go on in people's childhoods. It's not always the same at all. And this is what causes codependency. It's a trauma response in and of itself. And so something happened in your childhood that hurt you. Doesn't mean you had bad parents. You might have had really decent parents, but maybe they weren't so emotionally available. Or maybe they just weren't around for a certain period of time. Or maybe, you went through something on your own and you were really hurt and people were busy. I don't know. And sometimes people have cluster B parents or a cluster B parent. And so then everything in the family is very, very dysfunctional. So if you believe at all that you have codependency, believe me, I can help you. I'm out here to work with you if I resonate with you. And there is so much for you to learn and so much for you to understand. And not only about borderline personality disorder and your partner, your ex-partner, your on-off partner, but what about you? And what about knowing what happened to you in your childhood? Because a lot of people grow up and they kind of forget it and they shove it away. And then what happens when you're with the borderline? Well, they trigger it all out of you again. And you can't even imagine what you're going through because you're like, what? What's happening to me? Why I don't know myself anymore, etc. And the point is, that's what leads people into reactive abuse, because you just don't have any other coping mechanisms left. And believe me, that's not a time when a relationship with a person with BPD who's, really quiet and not talking to you much and stuff, or yelling and screaming at you all the time, you really need to take care of yourself. So, I hope this was helpful, and as always, take care.
You've been listening to the Surviving BPD Relationship Breakup Podcast with your host, counselor and trauma recovery coach, AJ Mahari. For more or get sessions with AJ, go to ajmahari.ca. See you next time.